In this episode, we're going to take a hard look at what separates productive pivoting from the kind of endless wandering that feels busy but does not reliably produce usable intelligence. Pivoting is powerful because it lets you move from one artifact to related artifacts and uncover relationships that are not obvious at first glance. The danger is that pivoting also makes it easy to build castles out of coincidences, especially when you are working with partial data and you really want the story to come together. Ghost chasing happens when you treat every new association as meaningful, follow it without a clear reason, and then keep going even when the evidence stays weak. Validating every pivot means you develop a habit of proving that a relationship is real enough, relevant enough, and discriminating enough to support your hypothesis. This is not about moving slowly for its own sake. It is about moving deliberately so your conclusions survive scrutiny. When you learn this habit, you gain a kind of calm confidence because you know your work is grounded rather than driven by curiosity or anxiety. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good starting point is to recognize that a pivot is not just a click from one thing to another, but an analytic claim that two entities are related in some way. When you pivot from a domain to an endpoint, you are claiming a resolution relationship, and when you pivot from an endpoint to other domains, you are claiming shared infrastructure. When you pivot from a domain to registration context, you are claiming a shared management pattern or timing association. Each of these claims can be true, partially true, time-bounded, or misleading, and the difference matters. Beginners often treat pivots as facts, especially when they are presented in clean interfaces or summarized outputs. But pivot relationships are evidence that must be evaluated like any other evidence. If you treat the pivot itself as unquestionable, you can build a chain where one weak link supports another until the whole structure collapses. Validation is the practice of checking whether the pivot relationship holds up under basic scrutiny before you build further reasoning on top of it. One of the simplest validation questions is time alignment, because many pivot relationships are only meaningful within a specific window. A domain might resolve to an endpoint today, but if your internal observation occurred weeks ago, that current relationship might not reflect the reality of the event you care about. Passive DNS helps here, but even with historical context, you need to interpret it correctly, remembering that you are looking at observed samples rather than continuous truth. A disciplined pivot validation asks when the relationship was observed and whether it overlaps with the activity window relevant to the requirement. If the time does not align, you can still note the relationship, but you should avoid treating it as strong support for your current hypothesis. This prevents a common ghost chase where analysts connect present infrastructure to past events and then infer intent or control incorrectly. Time alignment is often the quickest way to separate meaningful pivots from irrelevant ones. Another core validation question is specificity, because some pivot relationships are too broad to be discriminating. Shared hosting is a perfect example, where many unrelated domains can point to the same endpoint because they share common infrastructure. If you pivot from an endpoint and find a large set of unrelated domains, the relationship might be real but not useful for your hypothesis. A disciplined analyst asks whether the pivot narrows uncertainty or merely expands the universe of possible associations. If a pivot leads to hundreds or thousands of entities, you should treat it as a weak clustering signal unless additional evidence suggests a smaller meaningful subset. Beginners often feel excited by volume because it looks like discovery, but volume without discrimination is not progress. Validation means you look at what the pivot implies and ask whether it is likely to represent common internet plumbing rather than a shared operational footprint. When you make that judgment early, you save yourself from exploring huge sets that will not produce actionable clarity. Independence is another validation lens, because pivot chains can accidentally create circular confirmation where the same underlying claim appears to support itself. For example, you might pivot from a report to a domain, from the domain to an endpoint, and then find a second report that mentions the same endpoint, but the second report might have copied from the first. That creates apparent corroboration without independent observation. A disciplined approach asks whether the evidence supporting a pivot comes from independent sources or whether it is simply the same claim repeated. This matters because independence is what legitimately increases confidence. Without independence, your pivot chain can become a closed loop where every step appears to confirm the narrative even though nothing new was learned. Beginners often do not notice loops because the information feels like it is coming from multiple places, but validation requires you to track provenance and avoid confusing repetition with confirmation. When you do this, your pivoting becomes evidence-building rather than story-building. You also need to validate pivots by checking for plausible benign explanations, especially when the pivot link is common or easily produced by normal behavior. A domain might appear in internal telemetry because it is part of a legitimate service, a content delivery pattern, or routine software behavior, and the pivot relationships around it might reflect that normal ecosystem. If you skip benign explanations, you can chase ghosts by treating normal infrastructure relationships as malicious clustering. This is where your earlier work on cognitive bias becomes practical, because the moment you find an association that fits your preferred hypothesis, you are tempted to stop questioning it. A disciplined analyst instead asks what normal process could create the same association and what evidence would distinguish that process from malicious intent. This does not mean you assume everything is benign. It means you avoid building a threat narrative on relationships that have a simpler explanation. In practice, this habit prevents you from escalating weak indicators into major incidents. Another key aspect of pivot validation is deciding whether the pivot supports your hypothesis in a meaningful way, which means it should change your confidence or change your next steps. A pivot that produces a relationship that does not affect your belief or your plan is not worth much, and following more pivots like it is likely to waste time. Beginners often pivot because they can, not because they should, and the result is a growing pile of facts that do not connect to decisions. A disciplined analyst asks whether this pivot reduces uncertainty about the requirement, strengthens or weakens a hypothesis, or identifies discriminator evidence. If it does not, you should be willing to stop and reorient. This is where intent becomes the guardrail, because intent gives you a standard for judging pivot value. When pivoting is tied to intent, validation becomes a natural checkpoint rather than an added burden. Validation also involves recognizing the difference between a pivot that is suggestive and a pivot that is confirmatory, because not all links deserve the same weight. A suggestive pivot is one that hints at a relationship, but could be explained by many alternatives, such as a shared registrar or a naming similarity. A confirmatory pivot is one that is harder to explain away, such as repeated time-aligned resolution overlap combined with observed behavioral similarity. Beginners sometimes treat suggestive pivots as if they were confirmatory, which inflates confidence and leads to premature closure. A disciplined approach labels pivots in your mind by strength and requires multiple converging links before you treat a relationship as meaningful. This keeps your analysis proportional to the evidence and prevents you from building fragile chains. It also improves communication because you can state which relationships are tentative and which are well supported, which helps stakeholders understand where uncertainty remains. Chasing ghosts often happens when analysts do not have clear stopping points, so it is important to make stopping part of validation. A disciplined stop can happen when additional pivots are no longer producing discriminating evidence, when you have enough support to make a decision, or when the evidence quality drops and the risk of false associations rises. Stopping is not quitting. It is controlling the workflow so it serves the requirement rather than feeding curiosity. Beginners sometimes fear that stopping means missing something, but endless exploration guarantees that you will miss something else, because attention is finite. A professional approach sets boundaries, such as focusing on a relevant time window, limiting exploration to pivots that test the leading hypotheses, and revisiting only when new evidence arrives. This is how you avoid being trapped in an infinite web of associations. When you stop intentionally, you keep your work interpretable and defensible. Another practical validation habit is to periodically summarize what you have learned from the pivots in a simple evidence-to-hypothesis form, because summarization reveals whether you are actually progressing. If you cannot explain how the pivots changed your confidence or refined your hypothesis, you may be collecting relationships without meaning. Beginners often keep adding details, expecting clarity to emerge automatically, but clarity usually requires deliberate synthesis. When you pause and restate the strongest links, the key uncertainties, and the next discriminator evidence needed, you often notice that some pivots were distractions. This allows you to prune your work and return to a cleaner analytic track. It also protects you from narrative bias, because you are forced to confront whether your story is supported by strong links or mostly by suggestive ones. Validation is not only about checking individual pivots, it is also about maintaining the integrity of the overall chain of reasoning. To close, validating every pivot without chasing ghosts means you treat each pivot as an evidence claim that must earn its place in your analysis. You check time alignment so you do not connect the wrong window to the wrong infrastructure, and you check specificity so you do not confuse shared plumbing with meaningful clustering. You track independence so repetition does not masquerade as corroboration, and you keep benign explanations in view so normal patterns do not become threat stories. You weigh pivot strength, distinguishing suggestive links from confirmatory ones, and you set stopping points so exploration does not become an endless hunt. Most importantly, you tie pivoting to intent, so each step reduces uncertainty and supports a defensible hypothesis. With that discipline in place, you are ready for the next checkpoint, where we will review and reinforce the analysis and pivoting mastery you have built so far, ensuring the skills are stable before you move into malware-focused interpretation and campaign reach.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.